I know that many of you have been to Plymouth, and many of you will be very familiar with William Harlow's story, but I also know that some of you have never been to Plymouth. So I'm trying to provide enough background information for those of you who have never been and maybe need more of an orientation, as well as hopefully maybe share some new information or some details that even if you've been to the house, you weren't aware of before. Now, settler William Harlow was granted permission to salvage timbers from the fort house on what today we call Burial Hill in Plymouth. It was, of course, at that time known as Fort Hill. And he was allowed to use those timbers to construct his new dwelling. And so since the 19th century, the house at 119 Sandwich Street in Plymouth has been known for this association with the fort. Now, this fort was not the original fort built in the 1620s by the Mayflower Pilgrims. It was a later fort built around the time of King Philip's War. But James Thatcher, in his History of Plymouth, which was printed in 1832, mentions this association between William Harlow and the timbers of the fort. And so from that point, the house begins to be known as the Harlow House, sometimes called the Old Fort House. And you can see this is a postcard here from the 1890s. And even though in the 1890s, the Harlow House was a private residence, you still have this sign outside that shows that identifies it as being built by William Harlow in 1677 of timber from the old fort. And it says that there's guides available in the Pilgrim bookstore. So even though it was not yet a museum, the house was definitely a destination for visitors. And I think one of the reasons for that was because it had a very sort of quaint, rustic appearance, and in an area that was newer, mostly commercial structures right there in that part of Sandwich Street. But as a private dwelling, it was had been transformed over its history to accommodate the needs of its family and to accommodate changing standards of living. And so here's another postcard view of the house. This one's from 1905. Again, you can see that it's identified as the old Harlow House built of timber from the old fort. But you'll notice some things that don't look 17th century. So we have these rather large windows. We have some shutters on the windows, other additions at the back. So this is what the Harlow House looked like in the early 20th century before it became a museum. And then in 1920, it was purchased for $3,000 by the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. They purchased it from Edward Stevens, Mary Baker, and Ruth Stevens Baker, the last private owners. And the Antiquarian Society had just been organized, so they were incorporated in 1919. And in 1920, they were in the thick of the 300th anniversary of the Pilgrim landing, and they were really felt strongly that these first period houses needed to be preserved. And so first period structures in New England, we typically date from the 1620s through 1725. That's that first period of colonial building. So what the antiquarians do is they purchase the house and they set about restoring it. And to do this, they hire a Boston architect, Joseph Everett Chandler, who was himself a Harlow descendant. He grew up in Plymouth and had Harlow roots. And he was really one of the leading colonial revival architects in this period in the 1920s and 1930s. And he was responsible for the restoration of the Paul Revere House in Boston, as well as the Harlow House and other buildings in Plymouth. So unfortunately, this restoration was largely undocumented, which means that we don't know all the details about what he did, what he took out, what he put in. He was trying to restore that 17th century appearance, but of course the house had been used for centuries as a dwelling place, so it had been changed over those years. But you can see here, this photograph was taken probably in the early 1930s. Rose Briggs, who was the first curator of the Antiquarian Society, is standing there in front of the house in her pilgrim garb. And I'll flash back to that other photograph, or the postcard photograph, so you can certainly see how the house has changed. We know that we now have a shingled exterior. The windows have changed. They're still not quite appropriate for a 17th century house. They're too large, but that was actually intentional. The antiquarians wanted to make sure a lot of light got in so they could have educational programming inside the house. You can also notice if you compare the chimneys on the two houses, we know that Joseph Everett Chandler redid the top of the chimney, so he rebuilt the chimney, leaving the original base of the chimney inside the house. But we also know that he salvaged a lot of materials from the waterfront district of Plymouth, because again, in 1920, Plymouth was in tercentenary mode. And actually, one of the main projects was creating the Pilgrim Memorial State Park, where Plymouth Rock is today. And to create the park, they had to tear down a lot of 18th and 19th century buildings. And so Chandler salvaged, in particular, we know he salvaged bricks from that demolition to rebuild the chimney here at the Harlow House. So there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces coming together here at the Harlow House. And here's a photograph, again, from the early 1930s, showing the backyard of the house, looking roughly east towards the ocean. And you can see, again, two antiquarians in costumes. And behind, across the street, is Bailey Motor Sales. So that was one of those more commercial buildings that was encroaching on the Harlow House property, because by the time the antiquarians purchased it, it was really just a postage stamp of piece of ground. It wasn't William Harlow's original holdings at all. And this photograph in the foreground, you'll see a field that is prepared for planting corn. So that was an annual event at the Harlow House, the corn planting, and was actually done really into the 21st century. We used to have school kids come and plant corn as an activity in the 5th grade. So here's the house, and just again a little background on what the antiquarians did with it. But we can see from this photograph, again, this is Rose Briggs inside the house now, probably in the 1930s, and she is using a very large loom to weave cloth. And this was one way that the house was being used. The antiquarians were operating in a Plymouth before there was Plymouth Plantation. So if you've been to Plymouth and visited Plymouth Plantation, you know that that is a living history site where there's first-person interpretation and role-playing, living out daily activities. And actually, in a lot of ways, the antiquarians were doing that at the Harlow House before Plymouth Plantation existed, before there were other places doing living history. They weren't doing first-person interpretation here, but they had a desire to show the skills and the crafts of everyday life, and they especially wanted to show what women's life was like. So, you know, their interest was not so much in William Harlow. Their interest was in the women who lived in this house and women in the colonial period. And, you know, again, what were they doing? How are they surviving in the colony? So they would weave in the house. Here we have Elizabeth Bruce outside the house, and she's, of course, spinning. And then in the foreground of this photograph, you can see some of the implements used for processing flax, which was used for making linen. So those are just the type of activities that they were doing inside the Harlow House from the beginning. Now, I know some of you, again, may not be familiar with Plymouth, so I wanted to help orient you to where the Harlow House is. So here, thanks to Google Maps for providing this modern overview of Plymouth, and you can see Plymouth Bay and Duxbury, our neighbors to the north. The Harlow House is marked here with the large star. That's its approximate location. And so it's about a half a mile outside of the heart of downtown Plymouth, where Plymouth Rock is. And it's located on what today is Route 3A, but which at the time, which is also called Sandwich Street because it's the old highway between Plymouth and Sandwich, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. So that gives us just a general overview of the location of the house. And then I wanted to pull out, this is one of my, I love looking at old maps in our archival collection because so often they really give you here a bird's eye view of what Plymouth looked like. This is a map that the Plymouth Chamber of Commerce published somewhere between 1947 and 1957. And I think it's between those years because if you look at the center bottom of the map, you can actually see and I'll see if I can highlight that for you. It says right here, Plymouth Plantation House. And so this was the original site of Plymouth Plantation when Henry Hornblower had the idea to recreate the Pilgrim Village. He built that first Plymouth Plantation House right on the waterfront near Plymouth Rock. And that was built in 1947. But of course, in 1957, the Mayflower II arrives in Plymouth. And since this map doesn't show Mayflower II, I think it must date from that time period, the earlier part of the 1950s. So if you're, again, Plymouth Rock is right down here. To get to the Harlow House, you would go up. You could go up Water Street all the way, wrap around Water Street, cross Town Brook, and then you'd continue south on Sandwich Street, and the Harlow House is right there, and I've circled it. And I've also circled another Harlow House, which I think this must have been pretty confusing to visitors to Plymouth in the 1950s because there was a second Harlow House on their map, the Harlow Holmes Homestead, which is really just a stone's throw away. The Harlow Holmes Homestead is actually on Winter Street in Plymouth. This is a photograph from the 1950s showing that house. And I bring it up because if you search today online for the Harlow House, Plymouth, Massachusetts, you will come up with two houses. You'll come up with our Harlow Old Fort House, and you'll come up with the Harlow Holmes House on Winter Street. And this was a house built on the property that William Harlow once owned, and it was Knowlton Brakes Holmes who restored and lived in the house, and he claimed that it was the oldest surviving Harlow house. So he marketed to visitors. And I can show you, he had these photographs of the interior of his house taken, and he put them on postcards and he sent them out. He would actually let visitors come in and tour the house. You can see how it's set up in there. And then this is one of the bedrooms upstairs that was set up for display. But it's an interesting history because William Harlow, his first recorded purchase of land was at this site on Winter Street in 1653. Some records suggest that he actually built a house in that area as early as 1649 when he married Rebecca Bartlett. But our Harlow house was a house that he built after leaving that area of his property and building a second house around 1677. And now this house, the Harlow Holmes House, is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was added in 1982, but they feel that it dates between 1750 and 1770. So this is a common problem in studying the old houses of New England, because often you do have a 17th century house that might be buried within an 18th century house, and people may have moved parts of structures and rearranged them or built out on off of them to create larger houses, and sometimes it's really hard to tell which house existed. So some scholars would say that the evidence suggests that this house was entirely a new creation built on the site of William Harlow's first house, and some scholars would say, well, maybe there are 17th century pieces buried within. But just so you know, if you ever are looking for the Harlow house online and this one pops up, that's what it is. It's now a private home, so we cannot visit it, but it is still standing, so you could see the exterior of it. And it is worth noting that William Harlow did have more than just that small parcel of land the Antiquarian Society now owns. You know, his property on Sandwich Street was much larger. He had numerous parcels in Plymouth and in Middleborough, or sometimes referred to as Middlebury. And I'll go back to the map of this area, because Middleborough I've circled on the map. It's west of Plymouth. And so we know that William Harlow had land there as well as in Plymouth itself. And so that is, that's just a little bit of background on there. And I do have a question. Why was it called the Harlow Holmes House? And that's a great question. And it was Knowlton Briggs Holmes, who was a Harlow descendant and he was a Harlow descendant, and he was also a Holmes descendant. But that's one of those Plymouth family names that mixed with the Harlow, so to speak. And so it was known by those two family names. I believe it was also at one time owned by the Stevens family as well. So Stevens Field is right in Plymouth. Stevens Field, which is now a recreational area, is right in that part of Plymouth as well. So you do see those family names a lot. We don't know exactly which parcels of land. I mean, this is a research project. We could try to go back and do a deed search and see if we could figure out exactly which parcels of land William Harlow owned. We do have some information on them from a 1692 settlement after his death between his four sons when they were dividing the property. But in any case, we do know that he had meadows for grazing his animals, he had woodlots for getting timber, and he had acreage for planting crops. So he used the land for diverse purposes. So let's go back to our Harlow house, and this is what we're going to be touring the Harlow house today. And so what I'm going to do is actually switch screens for a minute so that we can jump to a different view. I wanted to let you all know that we actually in the past year have had the Harlow house surveyed. So we have this beautiful measured drawing that you can all see before you. And this was done by the Center for Historic Architecture and Design out of the University of Delaware. They sent a team up to Plymouth to document the house. So they painstakingly took measurements of every wall and every piece of trim so that they could show it clearly here. What I know, it's a little bit hard to see just because of the size of the screen, but what I wanted to point out is what we have here. We can clearly see the original configuration of the house. And so a lot of times people ask, well, what did the Harlow house originally look like? How big was it? And it's much bigger today than it was when William Harlow would have seen it. So from this floor plan, I'm just going to highlight on here, and hopefully you can see my little cursor, but we have 3 bays. We think the original house had 3 bays, and it was all on the eastern side. So this street, Sandwich Street, would be to the right of your computer screen right now. And the 3 bays are just basically spaces between architectural elements. So in this case, you might mark space between joists or rafters or major beams. And so there, you can see them here loosely. It's a little bit hard. I know there's a lot of dotted lines, but there's 1 bay here, there's a 2nd bay here, and then the 3rd bay is much smaller. It's where the entry actually was of the house. So based on a recent frame study, we think the original portion was this eastern side with these 3 bays. It was plank framed and it was single story. And we call this a half cape. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that term. And a half cape means that there's 1 door with 2 windows on one side of the door. And we also think that there was a very, very narrow wing off the back right here, which is sometimes referred to as a Beverly jog. So this is a type of architectural addition that was very common, especially in Essex County, Massachusetts. So we think it was just a tiny little addition, narrow addition off the back, and then those 3 bays at the front. And so at some point, the half cape roof was actually raised to a gambrel roof. And that's a type of roof, it's a gable roof where there's 2 slopes, and the upper slope is much less steep than the lower slope. So you actually are able to sort of add a little bit of height to your second story by having the different slopes there. The west addition, we think, was built between 1850 and 1870. So it was a much later addition, and that's right over here on the left side of your screen. It's labeled here as a storeroom. And then when that addition was put in, you now have a 3/4 cape. So you have one doorway, and then you have 2 windows on one side and only 1 window on the other side of the doorway. So it's a 3/4 cape. If it were a full cape, it would have a second window on the west side here. But we think, so that was a 19th century addition, and when that 19th century addition went in, then they completed the gambrel roof on that side so that the 2 sides matched. And so this is, this may be a little bit, it is a little bit difficult to understand. And again, that's largely because this house has existed for so many years, and it was restored in the 1920s, and we don't necessarily have documentation of all the changes that have been made over time. So we're grateful for architectural historians and preservation carpenters who are able to really look closely at the materials that do survive and try to piece together the story of the house. So what we have is a house that has evolved over time, as probably most houses have that still survive. So now let's go inside, and I'm going to jump to a different kind of presentation now. So hopefully this is coming through okay on your screens. What I did, just because it's so hard to do a virtual tour where you're actually sort of getting a feeling for the space, it's so hard to do that with just 2-dimensional photographs. So I have created some 360-degree photographs. And here, to orient you, you are standing outside the Harlow house itself, looking at Sandwich Street. And you can see across the street, where in that previous 1930s photo, we saw the motor, the garage. Now we have the Plymouth Central Fire Station as this red brick building. We do still have another garage directly across from the street. And then we can pan around, and you can almost see the ocean just through the trees. When the trees aren't in leaf, you can see it much more clearly. There used to be a building across the street diagonally that has recently been demolished. So now there's more of a straight shot to Stevens Field, and then beyond that to the water. And I'll just spin around so you get a sense of where you are. You can see our beautifully tended gardens, which are maintained by Antiquarian Society volunteers, along our stone wall here, which is the border of our property. This is a much later 20th century house. And then just spinning around, you're now seeing the corner of the Harlow house itself. And this door is what we consider the front door. And so here you have the 2 windows on one side of the front door and 1 window on the other side, which makes it that 3/4 cape. In the back, you can see our classroom building. And then I'll just keep spinning around just so you can sort of get that whole sense. So it's like you've made a circle around that spot of the yard. And I did see that I have a question. Where is the front gate? So the front gate is actually, that's a question about the gate right here that we're looking at. And unfortunately, we just had a pretty aggressive storm, one of these pretty windy storms here in Plymouth. I know some of you probably have been experiencing some hurricane weather as well. And so unfortunately, the gate actually fell over. So we have had to take it off the site in order to hopefully restore it and put it back up later on. But usually we have a gate right here to prevent people from driving on the property, although that usually doesn't happen. So we'll get that gate back up. And then a question, when was this photo taken? This 360 photo was actually taken this week. So you get, you're really seeing it exactly as it looks today. So let's move then to the backyard. So now you've walked, you know, you can still see the fire station through that tree. So you can imagine you're sort of reorient yourself. You're looking at the west side of the house, where we have the door that we normally enter when we have tours. So this is the west side of the house. You can see that beautiful gambrel roof there with the two different slopes going up. And then I'll just spin around again. So again, you get the sense of this space here. It's not a very big yard. We do have some raised garden beds, which our volunteers take care of, and we try to have plants there that are appropriate for the colonial period. And then here you get a closer look at the classroom itself, which is used in the summer for school programs, and we have educators who actually, when the house is open, demonstrate spinning and weaving and other handcrafts. Here we have our Harlow family boulder right there in the middle of the lawn. And then this is our kitchen building. So this is the, actually that's the other part of the gate that's waiting to be put back. This is our kitchen building, which was a shed, that 19th century shed that the antiquarians moved to this side of the property, and they outfitted with a kitchen. So this is the kitchen building, and then there are bathrooms in the other part of the building as well. So just to spin you around, there you've come full circle, and there you have it. So let me move inside now. Here we are inside as if we just came in through that west entrance that you just saw. So we are actually facing south, but we're inside the house, and we're looking at, this is a small addition that we think was put on in the 19th century. And we have it set up to show some coopering supplies. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of go pretty quickly through this area, and then go back to the other slide presentation to talk in more detail about what you're seeing in these photos. But you can see it's a very small space. We have what you're seeing actually is the result of the restoration that was done beginning in 2005. That was the intention of that restoration was to address some structural issues that the house had. And thankfully, those are all taken care of. But inside, we were able to have a cooper reproduce barrels and coopering materials to represent William Harlow's trade of coopering. But we can spin around. This is the back of the chimney stack as it exists today. I'm sorry, it looks like it's a little bit blurry there. So, and then if you go straight through this door that is, that you see in front of you here, we'll pretend that we're walking straight through there, and we would end up in a small hallway where there is a small steep staircase up to the second floor, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But once you go through that small hallway where the staircase is, you come into the Great Hall. This is the largest room in the house, and you can see here the hearth with its built-in brick oven. And again, I'm just going to spin around a little bit. These aren't the highest quality 360 photos, but it just gives you a sense of what the room looks like. And then the next room runs the northern, almost all of the northern width of the house. And so this was, again, another multi-purpose room. It also has a smaller hearth. Through that doorway, it leads out to the doorway where we came in. And you can see here are some of the tools for spinning and carding wool. And this is a flax spinning wheel that would have been used for spinning flax before you wove it into linen. And then the two smaller rooms right in front of you, I'll share pictures of because they're too small to do a 360 panoramic. And then finally, I know we had some Harlow board members who said, I have never been upstairs in the Harlow house, and that's usually off limits to visitors. But I did take a quick scroll or panorama of the larger of the two rooms upstairs. So again, not a very large room. This is a very, we have a fireplace on each wall of the two, or each room has one fireplace on the center wall, I should say, over the center hearth. The door that's closed actually just leads to storage under the eaves. And we don't actually show this room to visitors because it would be too dangerous to have them going up and down the steep stairs. So that's what it looks like. It's mostly just an empty room right now, and we do use it for some collection storage. So let me go back to the presentation where I do have a few more photographs that I think will help illuminate this a little bit more. So if we, and excuse me, I have to turn a light on. It got very dark in here. Okay, that's much better. I forgot that it gets so dark in the summer. Gets dark earlier now that we're not in the summer, I should say. So these are some stills of the Harlow house and of that first space that we walked into, the coopering space. So again, this was a space that William Harlow and the first Harlows would not have been familiar with because it was added on to the house in the 19th century. And it's filled with these coopering tools because William Harlow was a cooper, but he would not have done his coopering inside. So we have the barrels and all his tools inside because obviously that keeps them safe from the weather outside, and when we have visitors, this is a great place to interpret William Harlow's craft. And we do know that William Harlow was very successful as a cooper or barrel maker. There was a tax assessment done in 1672, and it rated Harlow's faculty as cooper at 40 pounds.
Yeah, I don't know.
Where
Jamie, can you help me?
oh, is someone having a problem? Oh, I guess we're okay. If you're having an issue with sound, just let me know. You can jump on and unmute yourselves and let me know.
Peggy needs help.
Maybe no.
I got muted.
Peggy, can you hear me?
There, turn the sound up. It's terrible.
She needs.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So the okay.
Going again.
I'm not sure. I think someone might be having a problem with sound, but hopefully they'll connect with us. So the town of Plymouth did a tax assessment in 1672 and rated William Harlow's faculty as cooper at 40 pounds, which was 10 pounds more than either of the other two coopers in town. So that suggests that his business was doing quite well, that he was apparently
I'm trying to figure out
very skilled in his craft. And the work would have been done outside because it was very messy. It would have been dirty. You would have been working with wood and able to shape all of your materials down for creating the barrels. It would have required a lot of space because these barrels are pretty big, and you would have actually needed fire to soften the wood, so to heat the staves and bend them. So you'd be using fire and water, and there'd be sawdust and wood shavings all over the place. It's not something that you would be able to do inside. But William Harlow had this large property here, so he would have been able to spread out outside, and perhaps he had his own workshop outside where he did this work. But in addition to being a cooper, of course, William Harlow was also active in local government. So he does appear many times in the Plymouth Colonial Records as a juror, as a surveyor of highways, as a constable, an inspector of inns, a selectman, and a tax assessor. And then he was also first appears in these records in 1643 when he was listed as able to bear arms in Plymouth Colony. So in order to bear arms in the militia, you had to be a man aged 16 to 60. And then by 1660, he's listed as a sergeant, which means he would have been helping to gather and train the men who were in the militia. He would have been training them in the exercise of firearms to help defend the colony if it was ever needed. And so we talk in this space. If you were in the house today, we would actually talk to you here about William Harlow himself, William Harlow the man, William Harlow the cooper. It's a lot of fun when we have school kids through the house, because cooper is a word that is not used a lot anymore. And so it's sort of interesting to introduce them to a new occupation that someone had in the past, and that was really critical, because you would use barrels, of course, to store food, to store liquid, to transport goods, across the colonies around the world. Plymouth in the 1670s had a population of only about 600 people. But they had 3 coopers just in Plymouth. So that suggests that there were a lot of barrels that needed to be made. Again, you could brew beer in a barrel. You could store beer in a barrel. Beer was the #1 beverage you would be drinking. You could create buckets if you were a cooper, and you could use buckets to fetch water and to do washing. And so a lot of the colonial outposts in the West Indies also needed barrels. So Plymouth barrels were being shipped down to the West Indies because they didn't have as much wood down there. Their wood supplies are extremely limited, so they depended on a colony like Plymouth who had the wood, initially at least, to create their barrels. So we have a question about the chimney, which was, if you remember from the first, if you remember from the first 360 view that we saw there, you did see that brick chimney right there in this small space. And the question is, was the chimney there before the 19th century addition? Was it an exterior chimney? And unfortunately, that's something that is a little bit of a question mark. We know that there would have been a chimney there, and it would have been on the exterior wall, but it seems like the chimney was reconfigured again by Joseph Everett Chandler when he did the restoration in the 1920s. So we're not exactly sure what the configuration would have looked like. So let's move on into the hall. And again, this is the largest room of the house. This is a view coming off of the that area that we were just in, the western addition, but now we're in the eastern side of the house. And it is set up as a multi-purpose room. It would have been used for food preparation, for food consumption, a gathering place, a place where people could do household chores, and probably also a sleeping area. We know from William Harlow's 1691 inventory after his death that he had a bedstead, an actual bed as a piece of furniture, not just a mattress. So it's quite likely that perhaps he had it here in this room as a showpiece. But in the 17th century, you wouldn't have had private spaces for sleeping. You would have everyone would have found space on the floor, and you would have had mattresses, either straw mattresses or, if you were lucky, a feather mattress to sleep on. But those would be moved out of the way during the day because there just wasn't enough space in your house to have a designated bedroom. So we also can see here, this is the other half of the room, again, where you're looking now at that central chimney. And you can see we did have a fire in it on the day this photograph was taken. We do still occasionally light fires in it, and we do have a wonderful local food historian, Paula Marcoux, who's actually able to cook on an open hearth and use this hearth the way it would have been used, so it is still functional. And you can see on the photograph on the right of the screen, this is just a peek into that brick oven, sometimes called a beehive oven, that's built right into the chimney stack. And so that's where all of the baking would have been done. So the housewife, the mistress of the house, would have to actually build a fire right inside that bake oven, and it would get very, very hot, and the bricks themselves would hold the heat. And then after the fire was coming down, she would sweep out all of the ashes and any sort of coals that remained. And you can see the broom there that's actually been moistened at the bottom so that it's wet, so that it's not going to catch on fire when it touches hot coals. So you'd clean it out, and then you'd very quickly put in your breads and whatever else you were baking. And you can see the small wooden door at the bottom of that picture, and that would be used to close up the bake oven hole. And that way you're trying to keep as much heat inside that oven as possible, because of course, once you remove that door, once you open that oven, the hot air comes out and those bricks start to cool down. And so you need to make sure it stays nice and hot so you can bake whatever you're baking. And then gradually, as you probably would stagger your baking, so you'd put whatever needed to bake the longest. Maybe it was even something like something similar to baked beans that you could just leave in there for a long time. You could put in the back of the oven, and they could just cook away to their heart's content for hours and hours. Whatever you needed to bake quickly would be at the front of the bake oven, so you could quickly open the door, quickly take out what you were baking, and then close the door again for those things that needed a longer time. So I always impress upon visitors that this was a domestic setting in which you really needed to rely on your senses. So you would really need to know how hot the fire was, how hot was too hot, or how hot was not hot enough, and you'd have to constantly be monitoring that. And you just know that by touching, well, not by touching, but by sensing, on your skin, the heat on your skin. You'd have to be paying attention to the smells coming out of the oven or coming from the hearth, so you would know, is it about time when those smell like they're done? And I know as a baker these days, I definitely depend more on my timer and on that heat gauge on the oven. I would be lost if I had to tell, is this oven at 350? I wouldn't know. So that's why we have those tools today. But of course, in the 17th century, they didn't have those tools. And one of the questions that we often get is, well, how many people actually lived in this house? So it's a very different world for us because, as I mentioned, there are no bedrooms. People are sleeping on mattresses on the floor. People are having to cook on the open hearth. How much food are they cooking? Who's actually living here? And as many of you, I'm sure, know, William Harlow had 14 children, although not all of them lived to adulthood. But only the very youngest, the last son, Benjamin, is thought to have been born in this house. He was born around 1678. And so when the family moved in here, it was William Harlow, and he at that time was married to his third wife, Mary Shelley Harlow. So we can sort of then figure out how many children were still living with them at that time. William's firstborn son, the first William, died as an infant. His oldest daughter, Rebecca, married the Reverend Isaac Cushman in 1675. So she would have been in her own household. She would not have lived in this house with her father's family. And William Sr.'s son, Nathaniel, was actually set out, is the term. He was set out in 1677 when he was only 2.5 years old with the Harlow's neighbors, Nathaniel and Lydia Morton. And now this may seem, again, like a strange practice. How can a father give up his 2.5-year-old son and send him to live with strangers? Well, he wasn't going that far. The Mortons lived only about a half a mile up the road from the Harlows, and they weren't strangers. Nathaniel Morton was one of the most prominent men in Plymouth Colony in these decades. And little Nathaniel's mother, Mary Faunce Harlow, who had died just days before his birth, she was actually a niece of Nathaniel Morton. So little Nathaniel is going to live with Nathaniel Sr., who is his great uncle. And this was a common practice of setting out children And it was often done to provide children with better opportunities, maybe opportunities for learning. And it's sometimes done to help balance the labor needs of the families involved. So William Harlow had a lot of children. Nathaniel Morton did not have as many children. In fact, he didn't have a son and heir. And so it made sense that his great nephew, Nathaniel, would be sent to live with him. And of course, children were a primary source of household labor in the colony. So there were a lot of jobs that even from a very young age, children could do to help their family. So that leaves us with 11 children who could have lived here in this house with William Harlow and Mary Shelley Harlow. Although it's probably likely that the eldest sons of the family may have already established households of their own. So they were, grown men. They were also practicing coopering, probably still working with their father, but probably had houses of their own where they could start their own families. But it was a lot of people in this house, so probably it could have been 13 people in this very small house. And again, it was primarily a farming household. So even though William Harlow was a cooper, we know that he owned cows and horses and sheep and pigs. So tending to livestock would have been part of the daily life here. You'd have to take the sheep and the horses and the cows out to pasture for grazing. You'd have to, of course, milk the cows. And then, so in addition to doing his coopering, all of this other activity would be going on around the Harlow family. And from William Harlow's inventory taken at his death, we know that he had plows and pitchforks and sickles and a cart. So he had all the implements for farming. And so it's most likely that there were farming buildings on the property as well, although those don't survive. And then women, of course, could help with that farm work. Children could help with bringing the sheep out to pasture. And women were responsible for most of the food preparation, including baking, as we talked about, and brewing beer, since beer was the common drink. Beer in those barrels that William Harlow was making. So we'll move on now. This is, if we again go through that door from the hall into what sometimes we just call it the parlor. This is the parlor looking east. So this is actually looking east towards Sandwich Street. And you have these two small rooms. The one on the left is a pantry, and I have another shot that I can show of that in a minute. And the one on the right is simply a small chamber. We interpret it as a storage area. So it's a place where maybe during the day, the family could store the bedding that they weren't using. And then at night, they would pull the bedding out from that room and put it on the floor. It could also have been a small workplace. So you can see we have a flax spinning wheel in that room in this photograph. But every room was multi-purpose, so you could do a little bit of everything anywhere. The pantry, of course, was used for storing food, and there's early evidence that there were shelves in this small northeastern corner of the house, so it does make sense that this was the pantry. And we also have a butter churn there. William Harlow, as a cooper, could have made something like a churn because it's the same idea, making a barrel, making a bucket, making a churn, same technique. And again, we know that he had cows, so it's likely that part of the household practice was churning milk into butter or cheese. So so that is one corner of that room. Here's the pantry, as I mentioned, so you can see a detailed shot of the shelves. We also have pewter on display and some other wooden implements, some earthenware implements from our collection. And this is the other side of that parlor room where we have, again, in this photograph, we have a wool spinning wheel as well as a flax spinning wheel. Wool, of course, because William Harlow had sheep, we again think that he probably was, using their wool to spin with and to make cloth with. And we know that it also mentions flax tools, and so flax was something that he could have grown, and then the family could have processed to make linen. So that's something that, again, with our school programs, we often talk to them about these different processes and activities in the house. Now I'm sort of taking you out of sequence here because we're going, this is a photograph taken from that front door on the south side of the house, looking into that very, very small opening, looking up the stairs. And so I had to actually step out of the house and open the door to take this shot because it's such a small area to get a good photograph. But you can see why we don't let people upstairs. These are very, very narrow stairs to go up, and they're pretty dangerous. Even for me, I'm always a little bit nervous about going up and down them. But they would have been added at some point later in the house's history. Again, probably when that gambrel roof was expanded, so you had more space upstairs and you could actually use it for other purposes. And so what's interesting, again, from those our 360 view that we had earlier, they at some point, again, we're not quite sure if it was in the 19th century or if this dates back to the 18th century, or it could be something that Joseph Everett Chandler put into the house. But we do have these two rather nice mantelpieces, fire surrounds on each of these small hearths, fireplaces that are on either side of the central chimney in the house. And these are very, very small rooms. You can see again the door here that just leads to storage space under the eaves. So this is the west side of the house on the second floor, and this is the east side of the house, the fireplace in the east side of the house. And then another view of the east, the other side of that east side second floor room, which is now just used for collection storage and mostly just empty space. So it would be great if we could have people up there, but it's just a little bit inaccessible given the stairs being as they are. And as I mentioned, we do still use the property for educational demonstrations of spinning and weaving and other activities, candle dipping. And so what I wanted to highlight was that one of our annual events is our Pilgrim Breakfast, which could not happen this year because of the coronavirus, but we did create a virtual Pilgrim Breakfast video, which you can go online to our website, PlymouthAntiquarian.org/breakfast, and you can actually watch that video. So it's not very long, but we sort of highlighted some of our favorite traditions of the Pilgrim Breakfast, which we have been doing at the Harlow House since the 1930s. And you can see this photograph is actually from last year's Pilgrim Breakfast when the lawn was absolutely filled with people. We usually serve about 300 people breakfast on the Harlow House lawn each summer. It's a traditional venue of fish cakes, cornbread, and baked beans, and it's really something that brings a lot of repeat customers, locals, community members, as well as visitors, and it's a really wonderful, special time. So if you go and watch that video, you can actually see a weaving demonstration by one of our volunteers. You can hear some 17th century music. You can see all sorts of things. So that's just a little something for you to watch if you're interested. And so that is actually all I was going to show you today. I'm happy to take questions if there are any questions. Let me see if there are any in the chat.